Okay, everybody, thank you for coming back to the Xanadu Review. As always, my name is Prester John Andrews. I'm your host, and you can just call me PJ. Well, today with me, I have a writer who has a very interesting perspective here on Substack, who goes by Emmy Rothwell. And he writes about everything from, like, history to kind of modern geopolitics and where they intersect. So, Mr. Rothwell, if you want to tell the audience a little bit more about yourself and your beat, and we'll get into it.
Yeah, sure. I have a Substack called Cosmographia, which, as you kind of described there, is mostly I write about history, and particularly on how geography influences history. Although more and more recently, been kind of edging into trying to use history to kind of explain some modern geopolitics, because well, there's a lot going on in the world at the moment.
Just a bit.
Just a bit. Yeah, that's kind of it, really. I'm British, obviously. You might be able to tell by the sound of my voice. I live in Edinburgh, in Scotland. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're the first Englishman I've had on the podcast. I've had a number of international guests, but weirdly enough, nobody in the Anglosphere. People from like China or India, but you're the first.
I'm glad to make up for that outrageous oversight.
So first of all, I tend to have a lot of people who will deal with history on my podcast. It's kind of one of my interests. So I'm always curious, like what first made you interested in history? Like it's a lot of different ways people get into it. So I'm curious what your entry was.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about this recently, and I think it was I'm very obsessed with maps. So when I was a young boy, I had a light up globe that I would have in my room that I would look at night when I should be sleeping. And I was always obsessed with like places I've never heard anything about, like looking at the coastline of Siberia, or maybe like the edge of Patagonia, those kind of like really extreme, faraway places. And I always wondered what people did there, how they ended up at these really, what seemed to me from where I was sitting in England, really faraway places. And I think the kind of the way I've always thought about history is kind of through the lens of a map, if that makes sense. And so obviously when you kind of get into the story of different places, they kind of come alive through the history that shaped them, made them into what they are. So I think it's sort of maybe it's unconventional way of kind of getting interested in the story of the past is to sort of think like very visual through maps, really.
No, it's interesting. It's I think it's not a totally uncommon way. I think a lot of people, like, particularly little boys, love, knights or Romans, whatever it is, or you'll get obsessed with like a particular civilization. Greek mythology is a big one, but it's something that I can understand for sure, since at the very least, when you talk about the way that different areas will change throughout history and how the geography will like kind of determine the fate of that place and those people, it's something it's definitely very fascinating. And you have a very interesting way of writing about it, which is kind of one of the first things I wanted to talk to you about. Is you have no small amount of success on Substack, which congrats of, but there's a lot of talk right now about the academic side, academic being, literally the formal university system versus this nascent, would you say, like, counter system where people are doing things online. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on how or why that diverged and how you see it going, since it's there's a lot of people like yourself who are hobbyists or educators who are getting seemingly capturing the public's interest on some of these historical topics so much better than academia is and has been for a little while.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. I think the first thing to say about that is the kind of history of amateur historians is actually quite a long one. Back in the day, the original well, I say original, not Herodotus, but like your kind of like Victorian or 16th century, 17th century historians were kind of just like hobbyist aristocrats. And the kind of formalization of history in the academy is probably only 1 or 2 centuries old. And so I think probably there's been amateur historians that whole time period. I think more recently, in terms of the divergence I think you're talking about, sort of like I suppose the rise of the internet has made like a hobbyist historian able to have a platform, which they wouldn't necessarily have had before. Although I think there's been a lot of kind of amateur historians that have published books for quite a long time. And I think part of the divergence is, I suppose, when I speak for myself, writing for a kind of a public audience rather than for other academics, is you can kind of have a bit more fun with it, and you follow your interests based entirely on your interests and what you think the lay audience might enjoy. Whereas like when you're obviously writing within the academy, you're kind of bound by the strictures of citations and trying to build a career and make a name for yourself through originality. And we also end up with this kind of like siloization of knowledge, where, as you know, knowledge gets the boundaries of knowledge grows ever wider. It's kind of hard to keep up with all of it. So we need to become ever more specialized in niche areas, and you kind of lose sight maybe of larger forces when that happens. Not to say that the academy doesn't do good historical work, because of course it does. But I think there's also like the academy has become incredibly political in the last 10, 15, 20 years in a way that I think kind of stifles interesting conversation. A lot of people are worried about being seen, or maybe the kind of the vibe shift everyone talks about has changed just slightly, but the idea that people were very worried for quite a long time about being seen to say the wrong thing. So I was kind of curtailing their academic interests or where they were willing to spend their time. So yeah, I think it's really good to have both. I think it's good for the conversation. Good. The most important thing I think about history, or the study of history, is that it doesn't get separated from the wider public. I think it's really good to have a populace that is well educated in history and kind of understands and is interested in the subject and debates in the subject. As soon as you kind of become too far away from the layperson, I think you, as a society, that's a recipe for bad things.
Yeah, it's and it's interesting you say that, because to shed a little bit more light on, you know, the question I asked you earlier, for me, what made me interested in history originally is because I grew up in history rather. I grew up in a very religious family, and you know, I was so I love, you know, the Bible on that whole period was something that was very was a strong early influence in my life. And you know, as a little kid, you take these things kind of uncritically, and to a certain, I mean, the degree to which the Bible is literary history versus mythology versus allegory, as you know, it's its own discipline. But even I remember being very young and being like, oh wow, I didn't know that the Greeks were actually real, because I'm like 5 or 6 years old. That you just hear about these things, and then you know, I kind of my interest grew out of there, about hearing about all these other different cultures that existed, you know, thousands and thousands of years ago. And it kind of makes me think of, since you mentioned Herodotus, is, you know, as you obviously know, but for maybe the audience who doesn't, sometimes called like the father of history or the father of lies, kind of interchangeably, because he has this you know, it was such a different attitude towards it, towards history. You know, some of it, interestingly enough, is today still considered good history, some of it completely fanciful. But I was thinking about that the other day, specifically because I was reading about the Persians, and you have some great work on, you know, Persia and or Iran that I want to get into later. The point being that we have to rely on Herodotus and some of these Greek figures, because the Persians were not into writing history down in these like very specific ways. It was very you know, very broad strokes, and all that to say, like the idea of history, as you mentioned, is like this separate academic thing, is a relatively new thing. It's always kind of been a proprietary blend of, okay, what actually happened versus how does this relate to our culture and our people and our history? Um, where do we, you being the listener, fit in? And I think that's something that people like yourself and like pop historians, which I don't use punitively, I think that's kind of the service that they provide, since it can be a little dry otherwise.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Um, I had a note once where I said something along the lines of, there are two types of people in the world: people who like Herodotus and people who like Thucydides. And
Hmm.
people who like Herodotus are more fun. And I stand by that. I think Herodotus is excellent. I think one thing to bear in mind when you're reading his histories is they were designed for public performance. So it was very much sort of like a well, I suppose it's sort of like writing a blog on the internet. You're doing it for the audience. You're trying to entertain them as well as hopefully inform them. And yeah, Herodotus obviously does have their reputation. I think it was Pliny who called him the father of lies the first time.
Hmm.
And it's somewhat justified sometimes. But I think what's interesting is a lot of modern research has actually vindicated some of the more outlandish things that he said that people thought were obviously untrue. So some of the stories he told about the Scythians, for example, as we've uncovered some of their graves.
It's funny how that type of thing happens more and more,
Yeah,
that the ancients have been vindicated.
yeah. Yeah, and I think Herodotus had it right. I think it's he would quite often tell you two or three versions of the same story that he'd heard, sorry, of the same event, but different versions of the story he'd heard from different people. And he does often say, like, I heard this from, and I've also heard this other version. And he kind of says, well, I think maybe this one. And he does tend to pick the one that's the better story. The story of how, like, Cyrus the Great died, for example, the king of the Persians. He there's one story that he just died, I think, of illness, and was in Persia at the time. Very kind of dull death for such a famous man. And there's another one where he's like, killed by the queen of a steppe nomad tribe, and she cuts off his head and fills it with blood, and it's a much better story, and obviously that's Herodotus thinks it's true. But yeah, I think it's fair to say that he's doing it for entertainment, but I think he does couch it enough that I think we can forgive him a few exaggerations.
Yeah. Well, and kind of like I was alluding to, I think there's a more proprietary blend that I've heard the phrase, the phrase, you should take something like, seriously but not literally, and I think a lot of those things should be kind of seen in that light. But that kind of does touch on something else you talked about earlier, about the modern political environment of like the university system, especially in history departments. And this is not like a culture wars slop podcast. That having been said, I do think it is, it would be a problem if I didn't at least address kind of the direction of where that's coming from, because I think that kind of feeds into the issue of maybe we could say like an overcorrection from some of the historical problems of the past.
Yeah. I think there's a Substack writer who's a philosopher called Justin Smith-Roux, who writes a great Substack called The Internet. And he wrote a really good essay a couple of months ago where he talked about the humanities tendency over the last kind of 10, 20 years to attack their own discipline. So the idea of like critical theories being turned upon the subject itself. And so they've kind of crowded out the original traditional kind of basis for some of those core subjects, and how what the kind of modern academy does in some ways is kind of raises the specter of the subject, so like history, for example, and then it teaches its latest students how to criticize it, or to like critique it at its core, and basically say it's like a rotten imperialist colonial object that needs to be torn down. But then it doesn't ever build up the subject in the first place. So the only thing that these humanities graduates are learning is how to attack the thing that they're supposed to be studying without the basis in it first. So it's, all for criticism of the history of a discipline. But if you're not grounded in the discipline in the first place, and all you know is its critique, you're kind of like, it's like attacking the building a building like without foundations, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Trying to break down. And so when you do that, you kind of create this kind of hatred for the subject itself. So it's sort of like a self-hatred, and then you end up with a situation where lots of people are opting not to do it, to take those subjects in the first place if they're not going to take themselves seriously. Who is? Do you know what I mean? It's difficult to argue the case for English literature in an increasingly like hard skills technocratic job environment. If even English graduates are attacking the subject of English literature themselves, it's not a recipe for a healthy humanities.
Yeah, it kind of I believe you've referenced the work of Peter Turchin. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah.
So presumably you've read what was the Cleodynamics book? I'm trying to think of what it's called.
Yeah, the End Times.
Yeah, yeah. Really, I thought that was a really good book. Did you enjoy it?
Yeah, really good. I think he's done really good work in bringing mathematical modeling and a kind of a data foundation into study of history rather than just
he's one of those kind of similar to what was that the Strauss-Howe generational theory that was like I think it was like late 80s, early 90s, and he talks about and I'm sure you know, but if the audience doesn't, like, these 80-year generational cycles, specifically in the American context, and that either Strauss-Howe or Turchin, or they kind of again make me think of these. Okay, yes, if you want to really dig down in the nitty gritty, you could nickel and dime them, as we might say, or press them on every single detail. But big picture, they're saying something that speaks to a truth and has value. But I just bring up Turchin because that was kind of his theory that like a lot of this, would you say that the very hyper progressive self critique, it could be seen as like basically like inter elite competition, that maybe there's just not meant to be this many graduate students for a history program, and it used to be something that people did when they were rich and bored and interested.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting point. And I think it sounds like it could be part of the story. Sounds plausible. It's his whole idea of inter elite competition. I think it's one of those kind of like heuristics that once you read it for the first time, it's suddenly a lot of things like kind of click into place, and you kind of see things in a entirely different light. So the idea of like even not to wade into the political slop as you mentioned, but like for example the Trump MAGA phenomenon. Like Trump is obviously a self-proclaimed billionaire, an elite kind of financier who's born into wealth, but the idea he's kind of leading a revolution within America, that's what it feels like to a lot of the MAGA diehards. And he is clearly an elite, not the same elite that was there before. So the idea that he's like a counter elite, he represents that within the US in the last since 2016. And then we have the similar thing here in Britain in terms of like Nigel Farage, the kind of leader of the kind of alternative right movement since he was campaigning for Brexit, and then more recently in his Reform Party. Like he was a banker. I don't know too much about his background, but I think he was like fairly well off, like middle class, not middle-aged background. But yeah, he's kind of seen as this kind of like outsider, this kind of like revolutionary by his supporters. And so it kind of just clicks into, everything seems to fit into that model of like revolutions are not actually ever conducted by the kind of unwashed masses. It's always like quite well-educated elites, but who aren't in power, the counter elite, as Tertian would call them. But yeah, it's like the whole, to be honest, the whole thing that Tertian approach, the Cleodynamics, he calls it, Cleo being the Greek muse for history, the idea of these like kind of grand forces moving in the background over the course of centuries. It's quite an old idea. It goes at least far back as Brudel in the early 20th century. And it's kind of, Brudel was always arguing for like including geography in the study of history and economics, and these like other social sciences. And so I kind of see Tertian as sort of bringing that synthesis into the mainstream in kind of modern history. Very few people. I think he was not even a historian by background. I think he's like a
Yeah, like a mathematician or something more hard science, if I recall.
Yeah,
It's been a couple years since I read him, but
yeah,
it's and it's an interesting dynamic that I think you've seen, at least in the United States context. Like I don't know how much of an American history buff you are, but that was basically the case with FDR or Andrew Jackson or whomever. And I think that's the if you're going to steel man the idea of that movement, I think that's the idea. To the degree to which that's true or it's working remains to be seen, which I'm sure we'll get into because I want to talk about Iran and Persia and all that at some point soon. But that does kind of touch on, I guess, one or two other topics I wanted to discuss with you. And I guess especially when you're talking about Turchin or some of these other people who want to have a more holistic view of history as well as geography, and like a broader meta narrative included as well. The two memes that I see, and this is just more framing again to take me seriously, but not literally, is like the West has fallen, and there's no such thing as the West. Like there is both. There's no such thing as the West, but it's also uniquely bad, like we've never ever seen in history. And the West has fallen, and it's there's no way to recover it. And I think it kind of speaks to if the micro is the where what you're talking about, where the university system and the humanities are, the macro being like where quote unquote the West is, where it feels like we're kind of in kind of a strange moment of materially, spiritually, socially, um, feels like we've kind of lost our confidence. And I do wonder about that sometimes too, because I'm not like a return to tradition person, but I do, this is my culture, it is my history. I'm, of Anglo descent. I know my family came from England in like the 1600s from the English Midlands. So there's a connection in that Anglosphere. And I sometimes wonder, like, is this our cultural revolution, so to speak? Like China went really hard against its own traditions, much, much, much harder than we are now, and it's just something you have to work out. And they're returning to this Confucianism now, or is it just like it's become too diffuse, and the nature of liberalism has just kind of it is over? So I don't know. I know that's kind of a broad question slash topic, but what are your thoughts?
No, I mean, if you write about history on the internet, the idea of the West has fallen is sort of the only thing that most people talk about. So
Mhm.
it's
Get it out of the way.
yeah, it's a great.
Yes or no, Mr. Rothwell, has the West fallen?
Maybe in the process of if you had to soundbite. To the first bit, is there a West? I think yes. I think it's a useful category to talk about. Group certain countries together, like so the Anglophone world, and then like Western Central Europe. I think broadly define them as the West. I think that's a useful category to think about history. Are there differences within that? Of course, but I sort of, despite one of our like modern obsessions is like criticizing all categories, and like all categories are sort of at one level arbitrary and sort of false, but also like they are useful. Like it is easier to talk about history if you're allowed to name things rather than criticizing the underpinnings of every single name. But anyway, so I think there is something that we can call the West, and it is useful to think about it as a whole in some context. Whether it's falling, I think it's hard to escape the impression that it's definitely going through a bad stretch. I'm obviously speaking from British point of view, and things are not going very well over here.
Bit of a hard time.
It feels like we've been in a sort of stagnating treading.
How many prime ministers in like the last 5 years? It's been something.
I don't think there's actually. I think you have to do like some kind of complicated quadratic equation to work the answer out to that now. It's so difficult to keep count. We might be about to have another one soon. The last one.
Yeah, Mr. Starmer seems to be in trouble.
For 2 years, so it's about time he retired. No, it's yeah. I mean, like economically, we've been stagnating since the Great Recession in 2008. We, as a Europe as a whole is kind of stagnating as well, although some bits are doing slightly better than others. But generally, the picture's not great. We sort of have a resurgent Russia on the eastern flank, which, while it's getting bogged down in the war with Ukraine, I do also think that like Europe as a whole is just like not mentally or physically ready for a fight of a peer rival like Russia, if they were to eventually defeat Ukraine. And like kind of spiritually, it feels like the West as a whole is kind of broken. And that's just this side of the Atlantic. I think the Trump administration, second administration, is worse than I thought it would be, and I didn't think it was going to be very good when they came in last year. There definitely seems to be some sort of like civilizational rot, and it's hard to pin down exactly what that is. Whether it's fallen, I think all things can be reversed. You just need to, if you can figure out the cause, then the problem is that no one agrees on what the cause is, and everyone's too busy fighting each other. I think
or the solution for that matter.
The partisan divide is sort of the biggest expression of that at the moment. If you're a leftist, you absolutely despise the right, and if you're a rightist, you absolutely despise the left. And like that is the most important thing in the world, in the universe at the moment, is like defeating the other side regardless of the cost. And so you have, Republicans who, I'm sure that within the Trump voting Republican Party, there are many kind of classical Republicans who would have voted for, I don't know, like lower taxes under the Bush administration, and yet are quite happy to kind of like turn a blind eye to Trump's grift in office, just because it's their side and not the other, and vice versa. Like during Biden's period, there was lots of people kind of brushing over the fact that quite clearly Biden did not have the mental faculties to be the leader of the most powerful nation in the world, and because he was on their side. And I think that we have that in Britain, although it's slightly different because we used to have a very similar kind of two main parties with a third one that's sort of kind of mostly irrelevant in the Lib Democrats. But now in recent, kind of like the last year or two, we've kind of had this splintering into 5 different main parties. So the traditional 2, Labour and Conservatives. We also have sort of a populist left party and the Green Party, populist right party in terms of the form, and then the Lib Dems in the middle still. And so it kind of like eating away the 2 main parties from both left and right at the same time. And it's kind of creating this really strange electoral map at the moment. Like if there was an election tomorrow, I don't know what would happen. Would any party even be able to win the majority in a system that's basically designed to always have a majority? It's very strange. And it just feels like there's just like a general pessimism. I don't know if it's quite the same in America, because despite your sort of the discourse, the toxicity of the discourse, you still have phenomenal economic growth over a similar period. And like, that's not necessarily been distributed equally, but generally speaking, I think real wages have mostly been, I think on average, they've increased since 2008, whereas ours have just absolutely stayed.
Well, we're also pathologically optimistic for better or for worse.
Yeah. Well, we're sort of temperamentally pessimistic, I think. So maybe that's part of it.
Yeah. Maybe it was the the trip across the Atlantic. All the pessimistic ones died. So that's or like what's that Frederick Jackson Turner frontier thesis, where, and I think there's a pessimism that is kind of sinking in, because I said that kind of cheekily, but the whole frontier thesis being like, as long America always needs somewhere to expand into, and that's what defines the American psyche. And we had somewhere to expand into kind of indefinitely with the frontier, and then the whole global empire thing, which is kind of hitting some pretty hard limits right now. And I think it's a weird moment, because I feel like on one level, I would agree with you there that it would take a insane misplaying of a hand for the United States, at least as like a economic, military, whatever you want to say, entity, for all the advantages that the United States has, to not be a world power in 100 years.
Yep.
That having been said, we're making a go of it. And I think there's a much bigger to me the biggest danger is like basically like a de facto like dissolving of the union and it becoming like federated. But that's maybe a different conversation. So all that to say, yes, there's a certain amount of pessimism that I think is coming with hitting those hard limits that any empire is going to let happen to the British Empire. It happened to the Romans, whomever. You overextend and it's become more expensive to maintain the empire than the benefit that you're getting out of the empire. And I think we're all just kind of trying to find somebody to blame for it. But
Yeah.
that's it's a difficult question. But I think maybe one of the interesting angles to discuss is, you write a lot about geography, and I think that's part of, and if you want to be very simplistic about it, that's what's kind of hitting us right now, both with things like the border, or more specifically, when we're talking about Iran, where, we're able to just kind of run roughshod over the world for, the last 80, 90 years, however you want to put it. But we've not really faced a peer competitor, really, if you want to think about it. And now the game has changed so much with drones. Like, since you're a history buff, to me it feels almost to the level of like World War One, where some of these 19th century generals are centering cavalry charges against machine guns, to the degree that drones have changed the game. So I was wondering if you want to speak on that a little bit, which is, I know, kind of a long preamble, but the whole the degree to which geography will affect any of these outcomes, and how you might say, history is reasserting itself contra Fukuyama, particularly in the Iran context.
Yeah, I think Fukuyama, just jump on that point quickly, is hard done by. I don't think he ever, his book title, obviously, was titled The End of History, question mark. I don't think he ever necessarily said it definitely was, and it's very easy to make fun of that book title.
And I was just being a little cheeky.
No, of course.
I think Francis Fukuyama is brilliant.
I think we've talked about him on Substack before, and on those that we both like him. But I think he's unfunny. Anyway, so I think the Iran War is a really interesting jumping off point in talking about how geography affects history or like contemporary current geopolitics, because they have a very interesting geographical hand that's dealt to them, in the sense that they quite a large part of their southern coastline is centered around the kind of very narrow Strait of Hormuz, where a fifth of everyone knows this now, we've been told about endlessly in the news, but a fifth of the world's energy supply flows through that strait, as does about a third of the world's fertilizer, a third of the helium that's used in lots of industrial process, including making semiconductors and computer chips, which are obviously so key to the modern economy. And then you, as well as that, having that geographical hand, you have the kind of shift in warfare paradigm that you mentioned in the advent of drones. And so we can obviously, this has sort of been playing out in front of us in Ukraine for the last 4 years, although not everyone, I don't think, is fully woken up to the reality that, as you said, I think that's a really good comparison that you made, but the idea of a cavalry charge, a machine gun, the US is just unparalleled in terms of the old war paradigm. So aircraft carriers, battleships, submarines, aircraft. I mean, I think the US Air Force established like air supremacy over Iran like almost immediately. Well, they did it last summer as well, didn't they? Back in July of 2025. And then we were just able to basically eviscerate targets almost at will, including killing the Ayatollah. And so you would think, like, on the face of it, it looks like that's a massive military victory, in the sense that you're able to almost kind of strafe any target in Iran itself. But the reality is there's a massive strategic loss, and it was almost built in from the start. There was almost nothing the leaders could have done differently that would have stopped the asymmetry of the new warfare paradigm. So the drones, or small boats just dropping mines in the water of the Strait of Hormuz, the missiles that Iran turns out has had like I don't know, almost an order of magnitude more short-range missiles than analysts thought before going into the war, and so they were able to hit targets, the US bases, almost the entire western coast of the Gulf, Persian Gulf. Almost every single American base was hit and damaged, including the I don't know how you say this, but the THAAD radar system, which are, I think, the most sophisticated radars in the world, and also some of the most heavily fortified objects in the world in terms of the defense systems set up around them. And Iran has been able to hit and destroy those in the American military bases on the the western coast of the Gulf, which basically meant that the US was able to having to send some of its fighter jets from like the middle of central Saudi Arabia, or from Israel, or from Britain have some legacy islands in the Indian Ocean where the US has a naval base. It's a really far distances to launch these sorties, and essentially that was basically because Iran had kind of cleaned out all of the ones nearby. And so you have this strange fact where, like, I think America must have something like 5 times the population of Iran. I don't even know what the GDP difference must be, like at least 10x. Far superior military might, but at the same time, there's almost nothing they can do to stop Iran basically throttling the entire world economy because of the geographical hands that they have, the chokehold they have over the Strait of Hormuz, and then also the new, like, it's almost impossible to stop a small drone with like old defensive capabilities, which are designed for larger objects. And so you kind of have this strange fact where it's almost like an emperor with no clothes moment, where everyone assumed America was still absolutely the superior military force in the world, comparable only maybe to China, and even then people weren't sure. And now it shows that like a small, what was considered like a middle regional power in Iran is able to kind of and actually make America look rather foolish. And so there's a sort of it's hard to see it in any other way than like the relative power of the US has diminished relative to other countries growing more powerful, rather than a decline in the military capabilities of the US. And so it's sort of like I mean, who knows exactly the entire reasons for the war starting, but it felt like from a kind of side view that it was sort of like the old hegemon not quite willing to see its relative power diminish, and so kind of trying to prove itself. And obviously, it's ended up looking more exposed than anyone thought possible. So I think the geography element of the story is really interesting. So obviously, the Strait of Hormuz is kind of quite well discussed, but then within the drone tech itself, obviously those are made from drones are essentially like a small explosive attached to a battery and a motor, which obviously fires the propellers on a quadcopter, or on the kind of, I don't know what it's called, the rear propeller on a Shahed drone, the ones that Iran use quite a lot. And so those are the kind of the same technology that makes a drone also powers electric car, like a motor and a battery basically, and a computer chip. And it also powers like all of our phones, our computers. The wind turbine is made from some of those materials, as are solar panels. So it's quite interesting that so much of the new paradigm of consumer technology, like electric cars, all those things I just mentioned, all powered by the same object. So you have this situation where you have Chinese companies like BYD, the car maker, or I don't know how to pronounce this, but like Qimao, which I think is the phone company. They also make a car, and BYD, I think, have maybe brought out some like computers, because all of those different devices use the same technology now. And so you can turn a phone company can basically become a military manufacturer overnight, because they just have to change what they use the batteries or the motors for. And then within all of those components are metals or minerals that are only found in a few places around the world. So there's cobalt, lithium for the lithium-ion batteries, nickel, copper, and then the rare earths that's been in the news so much recently. And China essentially dominates the what's the right word? the refinement of those materials, and then has a large natural deposit of those as well. And so those are not distributed evenly around the world. And so there's a geographical element in the kind of underpinning the economics and the military function of all of these new weapons, which is really interesting. So Iran is kind of interesting because it is obviously famously on a massive deposit of oil, on hydrocarbons more generally, as is the whole Gulf of Persia. And so that's sort of like the old energy paradigm, and we're kind of moving towards the new one of renewable technology powered by solar panels and, well, mostly solar panels, and then batteries and the motors that power the devices that are electric. And all of those are made from these new kind of minerals, which tend to be dominated by different places. So there's very little rare earth or these other metal deposits in the Middle East. So as we transition to greener energy and these new technologies, the shift of power geopolitically will be really interesting. So China will have a large part to play, as will Australia, and the US actually has a lot of deposits of these minerals, and so too does Greenland, which is part of the reason it was such a focus of the Trump administration last year. Or, well, it's probably still ongoing, really.
Mm-hmm. It's hard to tell. It comes and goes with him. He'll probably remember at some point. Yeah. But it's interesting because I try to follow these things as well as best as I can as a layman. But a theme I keep on hearing, many people bring up and kind of reading between the lines of what you're saying is it's kind of the reassertion of like the pre-20th century, like 19th century politics, or, as you have written about, like going back to like the 11th century of this has been the historical constant rather. And I was saying that kind of cheekily earlier when I'm, dunking on Fukuyama. Frank, on the off chance you're listening, I'd love to have you on the podcast. I think you're a brilliant writer, one of the brilliant writers of your generation, but not unlike, Frederick Jackson Turner. I think he described something that was kind of just in the zeitgeist that people felt, and was an understanding that, like, I understood Francis Fukuyama's The End of History before I read it, because it was just like it was taken as a given, at least for me growing up as a child. I think we're probably the same age. That whole end of history thing, which, and as we don't have to get into the specificities of it for the audience if they haven't heard. Fukuyama doesn't say literally nothing ever will happen, just like liberal capitalist democracy. It's just the end point of the dialectic, so to speak. However, I think the counter argument being that we're starting to see other systems emerge, and specifically because I know Fukuyama himself has said, like, okay, if he's already feels it's a little shaky with like the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, Donald Trump's rise, and he basically said, like, if because he thinks China presents a what would you say, like an alternate system, and personally I think Russia does too. I think he just like has that like baby boomer anti, like, Russophobia, I guess you could say, that they just categorically can't take Russia seriously, which historically is always kind of a mistake. But all that to say, that's kind of what I find interesting. We're seeing kind of these intersections of, when you talk about drone technology or AI, this like cutting edge, hyper futuristic thing that even a decade ago would have seemed like sci-fi, versus like these return of this almost like medieval mindset, or, at the very least 19th century mindsets of neocolonialism and like civilizational blocks, as opposed to like this globalism. And it's going to be interesting to see how that shakes out, because you're one of the writers who, obviously from a Western perspective, deals with Iran or China in particular, and their self-conception of themselves as like a civilizational state versus like the Western state of universalism, all these things. And sometimes I do wonder, like, if I were a betting man, it's so hard to tell at this point how all of this is going to play out. Because on one level, like there's a lot of institutional inertia behind the US as an entity, quote unquote West. Everything that's tried to come up against it so far has failed or been folded into it. That having been said, like there's maybe something to like China or Iran or Russia seeing themselves as civilizations, and maybe they're going to be able to, because to me, like, and there's no real way to get around. It's going to be a difficult couple of decades, or maybe even a difficult century as this gets worked out. And I'm by no means like a far right nationalist guy. But I think maybe there is something to like, China can weather this because they're Chinese. They have this cultural and civilizational continuity going back thousands of years, or Russia or Iran, whereas the West is a multicultural liberal democracy, which seems like if things aren't going really well and there's not constantly things getting better, it seems like the society just completely falls apart.
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting couple of really interesting strands within that. So the idea of those three civilizational centers, so the West as a bloc, China and perhaps Russia. So I think the West really is defined itself. It's like has two inheritances, from, you could simplify into like from Jerusalem and from Athens. And so the democracy, the desmos, comes from the Athenian democracy, and then the kind of moral universalism of Judeo-Christianity. So every single soul has equal value before God. We take those ideas sort of as a given, that democracy is necessarily better, the superior system, and also the idea that every single individual is of equal value. Whereas those ideas were invented. So at one point, those kind of things that we take for granted would have been utterly confusing to someone. So if you tried to explain the idea of moral universalism to an ancient Roman, they would not understand you at all. And that's part of the reason why Romans are so fascinating. As men, we are obviously, like all men apparently in the world, fascinated with ancient Rome.
It's true.
But some of the stuff they practiced and did was utterly horrifying. The entire society was built on slavery, like incredibly brutal slavery, and the kind of obsession of war and all these things. Those would be quite horrifying to a kind of modern Western liberal sensibility. And this is largely because of the mediating influence of Christianity that we have between us. So those kind of two strands of thought kind of define sort of like Western assumptions about how the world looks. And so we might look at a place like Iran or Russia or China and think they're kind of like abnormalities. Like they don't go, as Fukuyama would say, like the natural endpoint of history is liberal Western democracy. So these are kind of aberrations. And at some point they will eventually coalesce onto our civilizational model. But I don't necessarily know that if you don't have those philosophical underpinnings, that is necessarily the endpoint for your society. So I wrote a lot about Iran recently after the Iran war started, and I was trying to kind of understand the difference between like our philosophical underpinning and Iranians. And so I think what I kind of landed on in my reading of it was that Iran has a couple of strands. So there's firstly like the ancient Persian religion of Zoroastrianism, which at its heart has like a dualism between like the Lord of Light, Ahura Mazda, and then the Lord of the Lie, the darkness, Ahriman. And there's kind of like a dualism that you kind of see in the way the modern Iran talks about the world, the kind of the idea of the great Satan in the US, and then like the noble Iranian Shia Muslims, sort of like the good, the force for good in the universe. Then obviously layered on top of that now, very few Iranians are actually Zoroastrian. They're all kind of, well, the vast majority are Shia Muslim. And so you have this kind of, the Shiite tradition splintered from Sunni Islam quite early on. So the schisms in Christianity, like between the Catholic and Orthodox, or between Protestant and Catholic, came quite late. Like if the Orthodox schism was maybe like 300 years after Christianity had kind of been established, whereas the Sunni Shia schism was very early on, like in the first few decades of Islam, which means I think that kind of there's sort of a more hostile sense of opposition between the two traditions. And Shia Islam in particular is kind of defined by a kind of traumatic event called the Battle of Karbala, where the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad was murdered by the kind of soldiers of the Caliph, who represents the Sunnis, and then the followers of the grandson who was killed are basically the people who would eventually become the Shiites. And so at their kind of central understanding, Shia understanding of themselves, this idea of ground betrayal, and the universe is made wrong and evil by this pollutant crime that needs to be fixed at some point, sort of kind of great cosmic apocalyptic showdown at some point in the future. And so you have kind of these two strands, which are quite different to what we might have or be able to understand in the West. But then the interesting thing about the Iranian Revolution is it kind of had an element of the French Revolution about it. Kind of Iran is a strange country. It's like theocratic, obviously, but it is also a republic, and it has a parliament. It has fairly free-ish elections. Obviously, the kind of status of women is not what we would expect here in the West, but they also have this strange fact where like there's a huge number of engineering graduates who are women in a society where generally kind of stereotypically imagine all women walk around in burqas or have hijabs covering their hair. So it's a bundle of contradictions. So there's an element of kind of like liberal revolutionariness about Iran, which is strange. But the idea of like kind of a cosmic universalism is not quite as strong, I would say, within Shia Islam because of the kind of great what's the word I was looking for? The great grief of the Battle of Karbala that kind of goes back to the beginning of the tradition. And then with a country like Russia, I think what's interesting there is that Russia has this like long history of not quite knowing, I think, whether it's Western, is it European? Kind of Peter the Great shifting Russia towards Europe, building St. Petersburg. It's kind of Venice of the North, grand European style buildings, but also it spent a lot of time under kind of the yoke of Mongol nomads and developed its own traditions kind of in an Asian context. And I think even now it kind of like Putin's Russia is very much defined by its kind of opposition to NATO and Europe and America more generally, but also, you know, it has a very uneasy relationship with China as well. Like recently, since the invasion of Ukraine, it's had to pivot economically to selling a lot of their raw materials like their oil and gas, but also some of their metals like nickel and platinum to China at quite budget prices. And like the Russians and the Chinese have a very kind of tetchy relationship over their border and have done really since Russia kind of expanded their empire all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So I think Russia is interesting because it's kind of caught between two worlds. It doesn't quite know what it is. There's an obsession within Russian literature, particularly in Dostoevsky, over what is the essence of the Russian soul. And I absolutely love Russian literature and Russian history. Like Russia, I think, possibly above all, is the country that fascinates me most outside of my own. And I think it's partly that kind of, it feels like a kind of soul searching at the heart of to be Russian is to wonder what being Russian means, which I think is absolutely fascinating. And I wonder if there's an element of that, my hunch is that there's an element that runs through Russian politics today. There's sort of like a hostility towards Europe, partly because it's not part of it fully, a kind of instinctive hatred of like the club it wants to join, if that makes sense. And then China obviously is a totally different beast entirely, and like a lot of Russia is quite legible, I think, to a Western European country, and so is Iran, because Iran is Muslim, and so therefore quite legible in the Judeo-Christian context. They obviously have similar roots, but then China is almost completely detached from most of our philosophical tradition. So the intellectual ideas underpinning that as a civilization are almost are totally different to our own. And so it makes it all the more harder to understand. And so I'm actually writing a post about this at the moment, hoping to publish it next week, but who knows? Which kind of trying to understand the kind of three philosophies, three strands of philosophical thought, I think help explain quite a bit of Chinese history. It's sort of like a useful mental model. Obviously, can't explain all of Chinese history just for using a model so simple, but yeah, I think it's quite helpful. And these are the Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism, a school of thought called legalism. And all of these kind of appeared during the Eastern Zhou period of Chinese history. So this is like 700 BC to about 200 BC. So a period of about 500 years of quite chaotic war-ridden period where lots of small states in the Yellow and Yangtze River basins were kind of competing for territory and influence as the central dynasty, the Zhou dynasty, kind of collapsed in on itself. And so in that kind of tumult, you had these philosophers kind of wandering around the lands, visiting all these different courts and minor kings and chieftains trying to gain influence. And they had all these revolutionary ideas. And so born out of the chaos was a kind of philosophical flowering. And of those, it's called the 100 School of Thought period. And of those, that's sort of like a figurative name rather than literal. But there are kind of three main schools, I think, that have mostly influenced history, the ones I mentioned before. So Confucianism is at its heart, the idea of like filial piety. So respecting the kind of family bonds. A son should be a good son to his father. And then you, within the family dynamic, and then you kind of have the idea of the nation as a kind of large family where the emperor is kind of a paternalistic, benevolent father figure to the rest of the nation. Then you have Taoism, which is sort of more spiritual, less practical. The idea of like going with the natural order of the cosmos and kind of flowing with the order of things. And then legalism, which is kind of more of a Machiavellian. That's a bit anachronistic to compare it to that, but it's sort of good analogy.
Sun Tzu, maybe.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. So he was definitely part of this milieu as well at the same period. And so legalism, basically, the idea was that people are inherently bad. They're not governed by virtue. You need strict laws, and you need harsh punishments to keep people in line and make them act well. And so you can see these three strands of thought kind of throughout Chinese history. So the first imperial dynasty, the Qin dynasty, I think is how you pronounce it, it's Qin. The emperor was basically establishing an entirely legalistic society. So he enabled these really strict laws, really strict punishments. Like every single cart in China had to have an exact measurement, the size of the wheel, so they could fit in the ruts on the road. And there was a incredibly large surveillance system of informers and people put to death really harshly. He killed a lot of the philosophers we were talking about before, kind of wandering around China at the time, who were advocating for the other schools of thought, not legalism. And then under like the Han Dynasty, which came next, was a bit more of a synthesis of the three. And you kind of go through Chinese history, looking at all the different dynasties and seeing how they stress one of these three schools more than the others. And you come to the modern day, and I think there's obviously that more recent cultural import of Marxism that's kind of layered on top. But those three strands of thought still, I think, underpin a lot of how China works today. So, for example, the surveillance state, the social credit score system that so horrifies us. I think Han Fei, the kind of father figure of legalism, would recognize that and applaud it in the name of like maintaining social order. That's the thing that he would have advocated for. And then the kind of there's a Xi Jinping has in recent years tried to called for like a re-centering of Confucian ideals. So Mao pretty strongly rejected them during his Cultural Revolution, which you mentioned earlier, and she's kind of trying to bring them back. This idea of like a kind of paternalistic family view of the nation, with I suppose himself as the kind of paternalistic father figure at the center. So I think the kind of I've absolutely rambled on for quite a long time.
No, it's great.
I suppose the idea is that I think you can understand quite a lot about how these different civilizations understand themselves by kind of really trying to get to the root of their philosophical heritage. And you can see the slight differences in ways of thinking that are maybe thousands of years old, kind of create these like different systems and different means of self and political organization that you see today.
Yeah, it almost makes me think that like part of the reason that we're seeing such difficulty with, quote unquote, I'll stop couching it, the West dealing with these other civilizations is because well, for one, there's this idea that liberalism, and I'm saying, capital L liberalism, not, as we would say in the States, like, gay marriage and Whole Foods liberalism, like John Locke liberalism. It's like, as you're talking about, is this universal thing that all states will eventually come to. And I think we've kind of internalized that to a neurotic degree, because it was very like liberalism, and this is debated. I'm sure you'll have opinions on it, which I'll be interested about. But to me, it's like it's specifically like an Anglo-Protestant mindset that comes from a very specific place, a very specific time, and it was imported, arguably even to the rest of Western Europe through war or commerce or whatnot. And I remember when you're looking at some of these other places, say China, Iran, whatever, what have you, even if they are, and the degree to which modern day China is communist it's a long debate and maybe one outside of the scope of this podcast. But I do think, kind of like you said, it will align to China's goals, much in the same way when Russia was communist. It had the same concerns that Russia had historically, or in the same way that China has these things. And I guess where I was trying to go with this is it becomes difficult to deal with some of these other countries and civilizations because this is our mindset, and you can't, because at least I don't know about England and the UK, but when I was growing up in like the 90s and early 2000s, to even acknowledge cultural differences and say that, a Chinese person might think differently or have different worldviews and opinions, like that was so gauche. Was that the case in England, out of curiosity?
Quite possibly. I can't really remember thinking that much about it, to be honest. So
Mhm.
I'm not sure.
In any case, like that is and to say that, like, oh well, the Chinese or the Russians or whomever might not want to be like America or
Yeah.
the West more broadly, was like to say that, and like, not even like the tanky sense, like it doesn't reflect poorly upon them, it's just different. Like there's this neurotic obsession with acknowledging and valuing diversity, but only in an aesthetic sense. We love, oh, your poetry is so beautiful. People love talking about the fucking food. Oh, the food is so great. And it is, but these things do not emerge in a vacuum. And kind of, all that to say, I agree with you. Some of these cultural assumptions are just not taken into account. There was, you seem like the type. Do you listen to the Multipolarity podcast?
No.
You would like it. I would check it out. Philip Pilkington is the guy who does it. He writes a lot of interesting stuff. I just mentioned because they had a guy named George Yao. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Sorry, George, if I'm mispronouncing it. But he was like this, like a military advisor or finance minister for Singapore. And he was talking about, like, the United States and the West sees China versus the United States and or West is like, what is it? If I'm pronouncing this correctly, the Ulysses trap, essentially, like, rising power versus declining power, conflict and inevitable. But like China just like, as you said, has these fundamentally different civilizational goals that that doesn't necessarily need to be the case. And to maybe loop it to the beginning of the conversation, like what it doesn't necessarily need to be the this apocalyptic conflict, I think, and especially like the Western world. I know for sure the United States, like World War II is almost another founding myth of, it's become, even 80 years later, it's the farther away from we get to the event, the more mythologized it becomes.
Yeah.
That everything has to be this, again, like almost like this Zoroastrian, Manichaean, good versus evil struggle, where that's kind of the 20th century is like a historical outlier, at least in my opinion. I don't think we're ever going to see 20th century conditions again, God willing.
Yeah, I think, yeah, there's a lot to go into there, and I think, I suppose to talk about the Thucydides trap, which is hard to say. So that obviously comes from Thucydides, the Greek historian who wrote about the Peloponnesian War. He had this idea that the war was inevitable because Sparta, as the old, established but declining power, couldn't stand the fact of Athens as the rising new power. And so there was a conflict between them that was inevitable. And so the idea, there's sort of a joke in historians that Americans are particularly obsessed with this idea of the Thucydides trap, I guess, because they are Sparta in this scenario. Whoever rose up, they would be the kind of this old established hegemon. And so there's this kind of running question about whether China and the US will necessarily fall into that trap. Is it inevitable? And I guess the kind of everyone's assumption is the match for such a conflict would be the Chinese want to unify with Taiwan. And it's a very interesting question because Chinese relationship with Taiwan is not as old as is sometimes made out by the Chinese government. So it really, I think they only conquered it for the first time under the Qing dynasty, so in the 19th or the 18th century, I can't remember exactly, but not too long ago. There's also the fact that China really has not, for most of its history, not been much of an imperial power, in the sense that China is quite bound geographically. It has the South China Sea on its east. It has the kind of the Gobi Desert and the steppe lands to the north, and then a ring of mountains around the west and southwest. So you have Tian Shan, the Pamir Mountains and the Himalayas, and then you have the kind of the jungles of southern China, which kind of run into Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. So there's geographically it's quite well contained, and I think that's part of the reason why it has been such a large state within there, with the kind of built around the core riverlands on the Yellow and the Yangtze River Basin. And then, but beyond those bounds, they haven't really expanded too often. There have been periods in history that they have. So under the Qing, they conquered Taiwan, they conquered Mongolia and the Korean Peninsula, and they've kind of expanded into the western regions, so Xinjiang, the Tarim Basin at various points. But they've never really sought to conquer much beyond that. So in the medieval period, just as Europe was starting to kind of Portugal and Spain were sort of tentatively sailing out into the Atlantic, exploring kind of northwestern coast of Africa, and then eventually obviously onto the Americas. Just before that period, China sent out a great fleet of ships under an admiral called, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation here, but Zheng He. And he sailed across the Indian Ocean, visited India, the eastern coast of Africa, Arabia, some of the islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And he went on about 15 or so expeditions, visiting all these different places, bringing back not really wealth, but kind of, I suppose, like souvenirs from these different cultures. They would often trade probably goods that were worth far more, like gold and silver, for these cultural artifacts from other countries, and bring them back to the Ming court. But at the end of that period, the Ming sort of decided that actually they weren't that interested in exploring the world, and they just kind of retreated. They just mostly destroyed their kind of naval power, and just that was it. Whereas the European attitude, obviously, we know what happened after Portugal and Spain started reaching foreign lands, sort of establishing trading colonies, enslaving native peoples, kind of establishing colonies, settling them with Europeans. Very different approach to the kind of a similar situation. And so I don't really know where I land on this, to be honest. It's too difficult to decide, but I don't think China will, in the 20th century, be a sort of, its aims to be sort of globe-spanning imperialist power that's going to conquer territory. I think Taiwan is maybe an exception because culturally they've made it a big part of their identity that they need to reunify. So I think that question, I think they will eventually want to resolve that somehow, whether it's peaceful unification or military. I don't know. It's hard to know what their risk threshold is, because no one really knows how a war with the US would go. I think the recent war with Iran makes America look weaker than people thought, but at the same time, in the Taiwan conflict, it would be China that's the aggressor. So could Taiwan do similar damage that Ukraine has done to Russia with drones?
That seems to be the takeaway to me, at the very
Yeah.
least, that like war, even these great powers are people will like to, and I'm sorry to interrupt,
That's okay.
but yeah, that to me, that's the takeaway with these things is, especially in the Western, liberal media, people, Putin, tin pot dictator, is losing, 20,000 troops a day, et cetera, et cetera. I think Russia is an incredibly formidable military force, and you'd be a fool to think anything else. Same thing with the United States. It's maybe diminished from the height of the Cold War, but just the paradigm has changed so much that I would be, if China did do like a military invasion, putting aside, the United States would likely not stand by and let that happen. Just looking again the geography of the area, I think it would probably be a similar situation, just like the era of that unilateral, shock and awe, as we would call it. I think that's probably just done.
Yeah, it's very difficult to say. It looks like the balance of power is now with the defender, and even if they're a smaller power, as you say. But I suppose the thing that would give me pause about being too confident about that is the idea of China's incredible defense military industrial base. So they can just manufacture more munitions than anyone else in the world. They think they manufacture more goods than the US and Europe, the US, Germany, and Japan combined, which is a terrifying thought. And if it came to out and out kind of a war, but based on kind of missile strike capabilities or drone manufacturing, then China can outproduce both of those more than anyone else. Most of the world's drone industry, both the raw materials and the assembly of finished drones, is dominated by Chinese companies. So I don't quite know how that would work in terms of as the aggressor with the drones. Obviously, Russia is fighting with drones against Ukraine, although it still seems that Ukraine has the upper hand technologically there. It's really hard. I mean, it's almost possible to say. And attacking across water as well, it's a totally different ballgame. So it would certainly be incredibly costly, and economically, it makes no sense to do such a thing. But economics is often put to the side when it comes down to kind of national storytelling. The idea of national pride, political survival, kind of hinges on this question. But I think beyond Taiwan, I don't really see China trying to militarily dominate other countries in the way that Freudian slip there. The European colonial powers did during the 18th and 19th centuries. I think they do have a sense of through a lot of Chinese history. I think there's a sort of sense that China is so large, it's a world unto itself, and so they sort of don't care about things outside of their borders. So the idea of the Ming not continuing with their exploration of the world in the way the Europeans did. And I think there's still that sense that China is mostly concerned with itself, and so almost doesn't care as much about the external world as America did, as when it was the sole kind of superpower. And so what that means then in terms of how China behaves, I think it wants to enrich itself, make its people as wealthy as possible. And so it will do trade which is at the expense of other nations. I think we've seen that pretty clearly with their the way that they grew their manufacturing base by basically kind of luring. That sounds so sinister. I mean, attracting Western investment and technology, but doing it in a way that basically ensured that domestic companies would win out in the end by stealing technology and kind of those partnership deals where a Western company to build something in China had to partner with a domestic company, which could then eventually kind of take the technology and outcompete the Western company. So there's a sort of self-interest going on there, and I think maybe almost everyone listening is probably thinking, well, don't all the Western powers act self-interestedly? And of course they do. But so I can imagine, for example, Europe is quite a big market for a lot of Chinese goods. But I can imagine China like not having any qualms about economically punishing Europe if it didn't behave in the way it wanted to, for example, once it has the power to do so. I mean, it probably already does in some respects. And so I imagine it might be quite hostile, but like in more of an economic sense rather than a military one. But again, I mean, who knows? I think the trouble is when you have a country like Russia and China ruled by a kind of a single strongman, is you're basically at the whims of one person's psychology, and then who knows what all bets are off.
Wonder what that would be like.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, jokes aside, that you said something else that made me. I think this is kind of the interesting crux of the issue and like what the next century is going to be like, because I mean, just as kind of a historical aside, maybe that'll be their downfall slash, the West, or, ascendant Africa, whomever, will be able to find their in, because that was kind of the problem with China last time. They just, we're good. We don't have to worry about the outside world. And I believe that's what that gentleman, what was his name? George Yao kind of said, like, that's kind of their Achilles heel. And, they have their own cultural narcissism, as does the West. But you said something to me that I find, very interesting, that I think is kind of under discussed. Like, it's very game theory, very, logical self-interest that, again, has these kind of like Western, like Anglo-Protestant, fundamental presuppositions that maybe China, as we discussed, Russia, whomever, doesn't share. And I'm going to be interested to see how the immaterial is going to factor into all of this. Because on one level, you talk about, and there's a lot of like, China doomerism, China hawkishness. You have like leftist people who are very, would you say a tanky, who, you could substitute how they talk about China for how, Christians would talk about the second coming of Christ and or the devil. But all that to say, I think China, their other Achilles heel being that they are an exporter market, and if they can't export, they're kind of screwed. Much in the same way that we're a consumption market, we need to have that that symbiotic relationship. That, God, I hope that doesn't break down, because then that's World War III proper.
I would say, actually, I think that used to be the case in like the early aughts, but I think in more recent years, the percentage of Chinese goods that are exported is actually much smaller. I remember being surprised to read it was such a low figure. I think it's like less than 30%, something like that.
Interesting. I guess I'd have to look into it, but in any case, and the United States has significantly more manufacturing than what politicians and the popular discourse would have you to believe. But I don't necessarily want to quibble about the numbers. The point being that there is a certain amount of interconnectedness there that, and of course that's existed, before World War I. But the main takeaway to me is that, as with World War I, there are these certain lines in the sand, these kind of immaterial, important cultural things that I feel like the West is just kind of almost not really able to conceptualize. Something like the expansion of Ukraine, of NATO into Ukraine, was a red line for the Russians, much in the same way that, like, screwing around with Taiwan might be for China. These are like larger cultural reasons than you can just try to quantify. Like, it goes back to, I was thinking about, I think it was the very early stages or shortly before the Vietnam conflict that the United States got involved in, that the name of the leader is escaping me, but it was like an American leader, we'll give you XYZ, I forget, and again, I'm sorry, bad example, but like, we'll give you a whole bunch of money just to capitulate. And like, no, this is just an important thing to us culturally. It's not something money can buy. And it feels like we're falling back upon like these civilizational narratives. Russia, China, the Iran, it feels like it's pretty clear what they're doing. and what they can fall back on, it seems less obvious what the West can fall back on, as we, go into, what do they say, multipolarity, this, 19th century great power competition. It seems like for a while you could rely on, okay, we're liberal, we're multicultural, we're about business, competition, et cetera, et cetera. That works great in the free market, unipolar world. It seems like it doesn't really have the same purchase in this new paradigm. So I'm, with your historical and or, geographic backing, I know this is a big question. Like, what do you see like the next, the future of, the Western world in particular being? Because I don't know what, to me, like I have a couple different theories myself. What we're gonna fall back on, what we're gonna be, but I'm curious to what your thoughts are.
Well, I think it all hinges on the question whether we can shake the malaise that we mentioned at the beginning of this episode about how there's a sort of pessimism in the West. And so I think maybe it's useful to kind of separate the US from Europe in this part of the conversation, because I think America's slightly baffling to me. Maybe it's because I'm not American, but the on paper, obviously the richest nation on earth, the richest nation has ever been, although inequality has been increasing and that often leads to social unrest, there are, in real terms, most people I think are better off than they have ever been. Particularly, I think it may not feel that way to an American, but from Europe, when you look at any GDP per capita graph and you see the massive divergence between our two economies since about 2007. America was always richer in the preceding decades, but we were kind of mostly growing at the same rate. But then since about 2007, we have kind of mostly plateaued, and the US has just carried on like a steam engine. And so I don't think people in Europe have fully internalized the disparity in wealth now between the average American and the average European. It's actually startling. I remember reading Substack as an interesting example. Substack is an American tech company. I saw that they posted a job for like a customer service person in Britain, and I didn't really have any interest in joining the job, but I just clicked it to see what the wage would be, and it was like £70,000, which I think that is maybe for that role in a tech company in America, that's kind of normal. But in Britain, that is like double the salary that you would expect for that level. It wasn't a managerial position or anything. And so I think like I said, it's about double. Absolutely. It's one of those things that kind of really hits home the difference in economic fortune. So I think the kind of treating them separately is useful, because Europe's major problem right now is economic. I think there's obviously a massive problem with security, with Russia kind of menacing on the borders. But like economically, everything becomes much easier when you're becoming richer over time. Social unrest is quelled because people are feeling happier about how they're doing. You have more money to invest in your military, if that is a problem, which seems to be at the moment. So I think that's one of the biggest issues facing Europe. And there's a big barrier, cultural barrier in the way. Europe is like fully internalized a kind of degrowth mindset. So it's not that I'm anti-climate change. I fully, obviously, believe in the problem, and I think we should take steps to tackle it. But the Europe is so internalized that as the single most important issue, that is how every single thing gets filtered through. So the idea of housing in Britain is, we're like most Western countries, we have a massive dearth of housing, and so like almost every new build site has to fight through environmental regulation, and people talk about the carbon cost of everything, and it's sort of like it's one of those assumptions that's now so baked in that you can't see it almost in our political conversation. So I think that's a big problem over here. Whereas in America, it's very different. As I said, you have economic dynamism, you have compared to Britain, a huge manufacturing base. You are able to make things. We cannot make anything. If we had to fight a war tomorrow based around drones, I don't quite know how we would do it, because we don't really have a huge, we have a very small manufacturing base. It's kind of completely shriveled since the 1980s. We're in almost entirely a service economy now. And then but one of the things about America is it almost seems like your political culture is worse than ours, even though you are richer, which kind of puts light to the idea that everything is downstream of economics, even though obviously a lot of things are. And I think there's a thesis I saw someone write that I'm not sure if it's true, but if it is, it's quite scary. And it's the idea that certain political systems suit certain media environments. So in the 20th century, when you have like centralized publications like newspapers and TV and radio stations, liberal democracy is a superior system because you have competing voices, but generally speaking, they're kind of mostly on the same wavelength. And freedom of speech kind of flourishes in that stable environment where people kind of get the news in the same sources. So you kind of live in the same reality. And obviously a lot has been made in recent years with the proliferation of the internet and how we've all been kind of siloed into filter bubbles and social media channels, and we're kind of all having different conversations. And so we talked earlier about the kind of political bifurcation between the left and right. And I think in many ways, people on the left, the far left and the far right, in both Europe and America, are not actually living in the same reality. They can't really agree on like basic premises. And it makes it very difficult to have a stable political conversation. And it kind of leads to this idea that the most important thing is defeating the enemy within rather than kind of building a stronger country to face external problems. And the thesis of the idea is that basically in the internet paradigm of communication, liberal democracy is a worse system because it's a kind of chaotic freedom of speech discourse gets fragmented and basically destabilized within the internet, whereas like an authoritarian country like China, where you cannot really have like the equivalent of like a political substacker who criticizes the government in China. You would go to jail pretty quickly. So within that system, within the media environment, the authoritarian system is actually superior in terms of maintaining social order and kind of coherent sense of self and also like effective policies. And if that's true, which again, I don't know if it is, but it kind of sounds plausible, then there's a kind of a structural problem that we have. And that's kind of explains some of the problems that we're having in the West. So in terms of what the future looks like, perhaps there's a sense that if people increasingly turn to LLMs and AI to get their information, then we might be seeing a return to like a centralization. And I know a lot of people hate AI and are hostile towards it, but there is potentially a future where actually the Western discourse maybe stabilizes because LLMs act as like this centralizing narrative source where we all kind of live in the same reality once more. I know there's lots of concern over who owns those systems and what their motivation stuff. So who knows? But I think the question of what happens in the next 100 years is kind of, I would tentatively suggest that it kind of comes down to whether we can overcome this cultural problem of kind of political bifurcation, I guess.
It's an interesting way of putting it. And first off, I guess just as an aside, I would say like, I think it's maybe a grass is greener situation as far as the economic opportunities in the United States. I'm definitely not. I'm somebody who's like historically and politically minded, so I'm not one of those people who's like, oh yeah, America, it's over. I know relative to the rest of the world, even still, we're doing okay. That having been said, you guys have the NHS, so I think to a certain degree, these things, it's a give and take, as they say. There's no solutions, only trade-offs. That having been said, I think part of, and again, this contributes to the problem you're talking about, the bifurcation of the left and the right, which at least to me bear very little resemblance to the left and the right of like the 19th and 20th century. It's more like cultural affectations more than economic or political. But that's neither here nor there, just because that was and this leads into the other point of like, FDR famously, like his campaign promise, one of them, one amongst many, was your life will be better than the year before. And of course, it's not been literally every year before, but up until probably, there's been dips, the 1970s, .com burst, etc. I think overall, that's been true in the United States. And the bubble burst in 2008, and there's not really been a real recovery. I think, it's a lot of it is on paper. You talk about America doing very well economically. A lot of it is in, for say, like data centers, which is,
Yeah.
or paper assets. And without getting too off into the weeds, um, I think that's a lot of it is on paper. I'll just leave it at that because I don't want to get too off into the weeds. But it's an interesting theory because that leads into like both AI and FDR, because there's talks about, I don't know if you follow this, like, the idea of like, somebody like Curtis Yarvin talks about monarchism and like making that return, and maybe you'll see that with AI, what have you, just as like this unified source of information. And there, I see, at least from purely utilitarian sense, the value of it. Since I don't, and again, I don't know how deep you are into American history, but FDR was more or less a monarch, the way, or a populist strongman, in the way that he ruled and the way he totally overhauled and changed the government, um, breaking norms that were just traditions at the time, like term limits, etc. And everything he did from economics to military was just like a complete and total overhaul. Um, and it'll be interested to, all that to say, I think you're right. I don't know what that's going to look like. The fact that the people in charge of these LLMs seem to be the same ones who are in charge of the social media companies who profit from division,
Yeah.
that gives me pause. Maybe they are starting to notice. Again, looping back to the beginning of the conversation, when you talk about counter elites, people like, no matter how you feel about them, Peter Thiel or Alex Karp, these Palantir, or these types, the way they're talking is like, okay, the if there's proverbial pitchforks and torches at the gates, you're not going to be able to do business. B, the culture has just gotten too off the rails, that there's no baseline consensus, and maybe AI, because AI is, again, another one of those things. I kind of like to joke sometimes that when you talk about AI, it can mean so many things, from a technological perspective, a business perspective, integration perspective. Like, you could almost just say angry wizard instead of AI for like, the effect that it has on the conversation. But that's to I guess the beginning of the point of my question is like, what could it look like? I don't know. If like, there is a bifurcation between Europe and the United States. I think England and the United States are a little bit more linked because we're both Anglo countries. But I don't know. From a cultural standpoint, I do think that like the left and the right divide is in some ways very, very different, but in other ways, like, who gets to inherit this tradition, if that makes sense? What, be it, the democratic tradition, like, the Western tradition, who inherits it? Is it valid? Whatever. That, to me, that's the question.
Yeah. I think the hard thing to see at the moment is how either of the left or the right will ever see the game as not being to defeat the other side, but to kind of become closer together. And you can obviously have differences of opinion. I think most political persuasions are sort of defined by innate personality traits. I don't think people actually think too hard about, from first principles, how they think about politics generally. I think most of us just have a certain kind of affectation that kind of leads us towards one or the other.
I think a lot of it's post hoc. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like post hoc rationalization, exactly. But I think it's very difficult to see, and I think both sides are sort of equally to blame in the sense that they're so fixated on defeating the other side at any cost that it just pollutes everything else in between. And like, I'm obviously what's going on in America right now is really bad, but in Britain we haven't quite had our like kind of Trumpian or like woke moment, if that makes sense. We have kind of felt those effects. A lot of Anglo culture, I think, in Britain and every other English-speaking country is quite dominated by American culture. So we get every every good and bad idea that you guys have, it kind of ends up circulating among our discourse as well. So, the kind of, we had, Black Lives Matter protests in Britain, for example, which is obviously ostensibly started as a protest about police violence in America. We don't really have much police.
There was even
violence.
some in Romania, which like there's a non-existent black
exactly.
population
Like,
in Romania.
Of that. I mean, I don't even know what the like African population of descent of population in Romania would be, if it's any at all. So we sort of obviously felt the effects of Trumpism and kind of the peak wokeism, for lack of a better term for it. But right now we're kind of, as I mentioned earlier, like our political landscape is kind of shattering into kind of a five-way system, which has not happened for a long time. And it seems we've kind of got a populist left that's growing at the expense of the centre. We have a populist right that's growing at the expense of the centre. And it seems like we're going to go through the ructions that you guys are about a few years later, and it just seems like we've already seen the worst effects of it.
Hopefully, good luck with that, because it hasn't been fun, I'll tell you.
It's not looking good.
Yeah, and maybe that is going to be what it converges to, since I don't want to say this. I'm not like necessarily like a Curtis Yarvin, we must return to monarchy, neo-reactionary type. That having been said, it does kind of feel like that's what it converges to. And sometimes I do wonder if, like, democracy is just a blip. And it's kind of maybe the natural thing is to, even if you look at, like, it was basically what, like 18th and 19th century, the revolutions in Europe, all these things, are they a blip? Are they going to just find a way to find the mandate of heaven for the West, or as we might call it, our version being the divine right of kings, is like do we need, because I think it is something that is just so ingrained in our psyche of, like, democracy, etc., that I don't think you could just say, okay, this guy's the king now. You have to maybe find some way to circumvent it, because there is as you mentioned, there's a cultural context for, like, AI powered surveillance state, social credit system that makes sense culturally in China. Same thing with, like, the way that AI is used there versus here. They just recently, and again, put a pin in it because I haven't looked into the details, but, like, they made it illegal to explicitly fire somebody to replace them with AI. I don't know if they have some kind of way around that. But point being, the interesting thing is how they use this technology is for better or for worse, social cohesion, whereas the United States and Europe is its own thing as well. It seems like you're very, very heavy regulations on that. But point being, we can kind of circumvent around, like, okay, well, we're not going to say that there's a king, but we will, like, privatize these powers. We'll let private industry have the power to totally spy on you in all the ways that are real and imagined, in the way that the CCP spies on and controls its people. We just let private industry do it, so it's fine. It's the free market. And if that'll just converge upon, if libertarians will be vindicated, and it'll just eventually, the market will decide a way to, make it so social media, LLMs, what have you, just create something that's a little bit more socially harmonious, or it'll just be, culture war now and forever through the end of time, remains to be seen.
That's exhausting if that's so. I think
God help
one of the interesting things, the key questions, is the idea of the idea's completely on my head now. What was I going to say?
Culture war now and forever for the end of the time was what got you going.
It was something you said before that.
The free market will do the same thing as China.
Of like the importance of social order, I think, within the two systems. So if you take China and kind of Western liberal democracy, within the West, it's kind of the most important right kind of belongs to the individual, right? So we want individual freedom, individual opportunity equally for individuals. We want political freedoms, So the idea is that like the individual kind of is trumps the kind of the broader community, whereas in the Chinese system, social order is often valued at a higher than like the rights of the individual. So the idea of like the social credit system or the surveillance state is kind of a suppression of what we would see as individual rights, and it kind of horrifies us from a Western vantage point. But within kind of a Confucian sense of the world, like the idea of harmony, social harmony, is more important. So the idea of a son being as good a son as he can to his father, kind of he's giving up some of his own agency in order to be a good son. And sort of that's kind of extrapolate that to the wider state. So the idea of kind of community over the individual. And I think that really kind of gets to the core of what you're talking about. Like the idea, I cannot imagine, and maybe I'm being naive, but I cannot imagine the West being able, a government being able to implement a kind of social credit score or a suppression of individual freedoms in the same way in the US, particularly in the US, because you have such a kind of your founding myth is sort of like rebelling against the kind of monarchist, evil British.
Yeah, you guys.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a great tragedy. 1776, everything's been downhill, really. So that's kind of like right at the core of your like founding myth. And similar in Britain, although ours is obviously a bit older, like Magna Carta. The idea that a government, no matter how self-interested or kind of interwoven with like the big tech kind of AI overlords, that they could implement that kind of system here, even if they wanted to, just seems so cutting against the grain of everything that makes the West the West. I cannot quite imagine it. And maybe I'm being naive, and maybe this will come back to bite us because we won't see it coming. But it seems like that system could only really work in a Chinese context. We're not here. But I don't know what you think about that.
No, I think well, that's kind of what I was getting at when I said, you can use technology to kind of circumvent it or wag the dog, so to speak. And maybe I'm just, at this point, way talking out of my ass. I mean, there are ways that, because I was thinking about, as as we're both content creators, is the dirty term for it. I know we like to think of ourselves as writers, philosopher kings, etc. But we are content creators, and Substack is still fairly nascent in its monetization. How big it'll get remains to be seen. But I was thinking about how relatively easy and cheap it would be if somebody is, say, a dissident in the West in a way that is not kosher, outside of the discourse. I was reading something about that, like for relatively easy and cheap, without even explicitly saying, "Hey, I'm going to approach you. You can talk about X, Y, and Z, but not A, B, and C." You just will through what do you call it? Like the live stream donations. If you say X, Y, and Z, you get donations. If you say 1, 2, and 3, you don't get donations. And if you could maybe do that through AI, large language models, these machine learnings, what have you, if maybe there's a way to like do that in an organic way, or just without people noticing, I don't know. That remains to be seen. Sometimes, and this is maybe a bigger conversation than is the scope for this podcast. Sometimes, as I said earlier, like the evil wizard angle, like AI, it's a Hail Mary for this system as it stands. The system being maybe like the post-World War II consensus, something like, I don't know if you read Paul Kingsnorth, you would push it farther back. I don't know. It feels like it's either going to be that, just kind of federation and people retreat into smaller communities, or there's going to be somebody who's like a Caesar-like figure who's just going to say, like an FDR or a Cromwell, just like, we're cutting the Gordian knot, kind of incorporating aspects of both sides, and then just kind of a reset culturally. Yeah. That feels maybe most likely in the American context to me. I can't speak to the English one. I know English history and the broadest of strokes, and then like really deep on, I've like read a book about Cromwell or, what have you topic. I can't speak to the English tradition other than that, like, shared common cultural heritage that we have. But I think there's maybe more of a tradition there in England. I'll let you speak to that. Western Europe, I have no idea.
Yeah, I mean, the way that's sort of the conclusion I've come to, in the sense of wondering what it is that's going to get us out of this current malaise in British politics, is a sort of kind of maybe a naive, listless hope that there will be someone who comes along who's like really charismatic and competent. Some two characteristics that we've had quite a dearth of in our political and our many prime ministers over the recent years. Yeah, that would come and kind of unify the country. I don't know who that is. Like I look around our current crop of politicians, and there's very few I think are competent or even slightly good at being politicians. Really, I think being a politician is a very interesting job, because you sort of, we often tend to think of it as like being ideological, and I think that's probably actually, you don't have to be very ideological to be a very good politician. Like I think Ronald Reagan, for whatever your opinion is of him and his policies, he was a very good politician, because he basically he understood that it was basically you're playing a role, like you're kind of an actor, I guess, and you're playing the statesman. And I think you need that in your political figure if you're going to unify a country in the way that we kind of need them to at the moment. I don't know who that is. We currently have a very boring kind of piece of wet lettuce as a prime minister who doesn't really seem to stand for anything, or even care, or even particularly have an idea of what he would like Britain to look like. He doesn't really articulate anything very well, but also desperately clinging on to his job as best he can. I don't really know why. He doesn't seem to enjoy it, but anyway, that's beside the point. But yeah, I suppose to reiterate, I kind of disagree with my hope essentially is that we kind of have some sort of charismatic figure, and that's dangerous, isn't it? Because you can fall into a trap of, you mentioned like Caesar-like figure, and obviously Caesar was, he cared more about his own interest than that of the Republic.
Clearly. Yeah, and I guess TBD, because I think we're coming up to the same conclusion. But I know it's getting pretty late there, so maybe we'll start bringing it to a close. I always ask, do you have any closing thoughts with all of this? Anything that's unsaid that you want to get out there before we start winding down?
No, other than saying thank you very much for having me on. It's been great to speak with you. I've enjoyed your work and your notes on Substack for a while. You have the best Substack name, I think, out there.
Thank you. I kind of, it's one of those things where I came up with it after thinking about it for about a minute, and then it became thematically appropriate later in different ways, because I like to deal in kind of, as you can imagine with this conversation, like the ambiguity of the modern world, and I think like the ambiguity of the Legend of Prester John speaks to that. But all that having been said, do you want to give any plugs or promotions other than, obviously check out Emmy Rothwell on Substack, subscribe, all that stuff?
Yeah, really just the Substack, so cosmographia.substack.com.
Yeah. Check it out. The China series you're doing right now is really great. I'm really enjoying that.
Thank you. It's very kind of you.
Okay. The final question I always ask all my guests is like a fun little sign off is, we got a little into the weeds and or doom and gloom on this podcast. That having been said, there's always a silver lining. So I always ask, what's something that makes you hopeful for the future?
That's a really interesting question. I think this is it's almost kind of sounds counterintuitive, but when you read a lot of history, as I do, I'm sure you have to get the same impression. Like, a lot of history is really bad. And there's always cycles between good things and bad things. And it feels sort of like we are kind of on a decline at the moment in terms of this kind of malaise or pessimism that's kind of settling over Western political culture in recent years. But I think you can always find a time in history when it's been worse. And if you have a period of relative decline, I think the history shows that there's always a bounce back later. So it might be centuries away. We might not see it, but I think we have a tendency to always think we live in the worst of times. That we are living the most important time of history, whether it's because global warming is going to end the world or AI is going to kill us all. It's very kind of fits in a millenarian tradition that goes back thousands and thousands of years. And the truth is, probably just quite ordinary, living in quite ordinary times. And if things are bad now, they'll probably get better later. So.
Well, I think that's a great sentiment to end on. And I'll say, Mr. Rothwell, thank you so much for doing the show. I enjoyed this conversation quite a bit.
Thank you very much. As did I.
All right. Well, you have a great rest of your evening.